The door wasn't locked. That's what haunts him the most. There was no security code, no fingerprint scanner, just an old, creaky door at the end of a hallway he'd never paid much attention to. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In that moment, Prince Harry wasn't a royal, a father, or a husband. He was a man standing on the threshold of a truth he wasn't meant to see. What he found inside was not what he expected. Not even close. The room was quiet, cold, and dimly lit. The air hung heavy, like secrets had soaked into the walls over time. The walls themselves, they were alive with obsession, photographs, notes, printouts, scribbled thoughts, timelines, and red string weaving across thumbtacked portraits like a battlefield strategy map. Not of enemies in a war zone, but of his family. His blood. Kate, William, Charles, Camilla, even the Queen, now gone, stared silently from the edges of this private war board. In the center of the room sat a single chair, facing the madness, like someone had been studying them for years. This wasn't an office. This wasn't a journal. This wasn't therapy. This was something else. Something calculated. He didn't call out her name. He didn't move. He just stood there, trying to understand what he was looking at. And as the pieces began to connect, as he read the margins of those notes, as he saw the underlined words, optics, leverage, turning point, public sympathy, he felt a shift inside him. Everything they'd been through, every headline, every feud, every tearful moment. Was it real, or was it scripted? Before we dive into the full discovery, you need to understand how we got here. This story didn't start with a secret room. It didn't start with red string. It began with a love story that captured the world. Prince and an actress. A fairy tale for the modern age. The public was enchanted. Harry, the wild one, the rebel of the royal family, had found his match in Meghan Markle, a beautiful, charismatic woman who spoke of love, justice, and healing. She brought Hollywood sparkle to royal tradition. She brought activism to aristocracy. And for a while it worked. But something was always off. Not to everyone, not immediately, but to a few. The way she spoke of the royals. The subtle slights in interviews. The curated image. The carefully timed releases of information that always seemed to tilt public sympathy in her direction. Was it coincidence? Or was it chess? The story the world was sold is one we've all seen before. The oppressed outsider marries into a cold, outdated institution. She's misunderstood, mistreated, and eventually forced to flee. But what if that narrative, convenient as it is, was a mask? What if Meghan wasn't running from anything, but towards something? It's easy to dismiss conspiracy theories. The internet is full of them. But this isn't a theory. This is something else. A calculated campaign built over years, documented in a private room that was never meant to be found. Harry didn't leak this. He hasn't spoken publicly about what he saw. But those who know him say he's changed. Quieter, distracted, less convinced that he's on the right side of the war he helped start. And if you've followed the headlines over the last few years, maybe you've noticed the inconsistencies too. The interviews that contradicted previous statements. The Netflix documentary that glossed over key facts. The memoir that painted Meghan as a bystander in moments where others claim she was the architect. The silences that grew louder than words. Why does any of this matter now? Because truth matters. Because image is powerful. And because influence, when used deceptively, can tear down institutions, families, and legacies. And the truth is that this story isn't just about one room. It's about everything that led up to it. And everything it threatens to destroy. Over the next hour, we're going to break this down piece by piece. You'll see what Harry saw. You'll learn what was on those walls, what was in those notes, and what this all reveals about Meghan Markle's intentions. Not just toward the royal family, but toward the public that embraced her. This is not a smear campaign. This is not gossip. This is documentation, analysis, testimony. You'll hear from royal aides, behavioral experts, and even anonymous sources close to the Sussex circle. You'll get the full timeline of Meghan's entry into the royal family, the early signs of control, the media manipulation strategies, and the slow but steady effort to isolate Harry from his roots. But before we begin peeling back the layers, I want to ask you a question. How well do you really know someone? Because Prince Harry, for all his love, for all his devotion, for all his rebellion in her name, he didn't know her as well as he thought he did. And if the man sleeping beside her every night didn't see it coming, what chance did the rest of us have? Stay with us. What comes next will change the way you see this story forever. Let's begin. Started like any other morning. Overcast skies, the hum of a quiet estate in Montecito, and Harry halfway through a cup of coffee before Meghan came downstairs. Nothing about the day felt unusual at first. He had gotten into the habit of taking early walks around the property, usually with the dogs. Sometimes he'd make his way through the garden. Other times he'd pace the halls inside, half lost in thought. That morning, Meghan had been unusually quiet, distant. She said she had a Zoom meeting scheduled, something about a nonprofit board. Harry kissed her on the cheek and gave her space. But something was bothering him. He couldn't put his finger on it. A tension, subtle but present. The kind of energy you feel more than see. A look she gave when he asked a simple question. A pause. A hesitation. Stuck with him. That morning, he wandered further than usual inside the house. Their Montecito estate was large but not palatial. Still, there were corners he hadn't fully explored. Rooms that were mostly used for storage, forgotten by decorators, ignored by guests. As he made his way through the hallways, he noticed something strange at the end of a rarely used corridor. An old door slightly ajar, one he could have sworn was always closed. He walked over casually at first. There wasn't anything suspicious about it. Just a door. But when he reached out and nudged it open, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was like walking into another world. The room was dark, not pitch black. There was light filtering in through the blinds, but dim enough that it took his eyes a moment to adjust. What he saw next stopped him cold. The walls. They were covered. From floor to ceiling, every inch was plastered with photographs, notes, printed emails, highlighted articles, and hundreds, maybe thousands, of handwritten annotations. Lines of red thread crisscrossed the wall, connecting images like a detective's crime board. It looked like something out of a thriller. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. At the center of the board was a large image of Kate Middleton, Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Beneath her, arrows pointed outward to Prince William, King Charles, Queen Camilla, and a series of lesser-known royals. There were phrases underlined in black ink. Media strategy, leak patterns, sympathy optics. There were even labels like weak point, narrative inversion, and public enemy versus private threat. Harry's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward slowly, as if his movement might trigger some kind of trap. The details on the wall were chilling. Dates scribbled beside photos, quotes circled and dissected, body language observations next to screenshots of public appearances. Meghan had studied them, not just observed, but analyzed. Like she was preparing for battle. In one corner of the wall, he saw a section labeled, "The Kate Effect." Beneath it, notes referenced public favorability scores, fashion comparisons, and a list of headlines where Kate had been praised in contrast to Meghan. There were question marks in red ink. How to fracture this? Exploit through misstep? It didn't sound like jealousy. It sounded like strategy. He moved to another section, focused on Charles. There were documents that looked like summaries of family conversations, quotes that Harry vaguely remembered from private dinners. He had told Meghan those things in confidence. Here they were, dissected for tone, implications, emotional weight. He felt sick. The worst part wasn't just that this room existed. It was that it had clearly existed for a long time. This wasn't a recent project. There were notes dated all the way back to 2018, the year of their wedding. He turned to the table in the center of the room. On it sat an open notebook, still uncapped pen resting beside it. As if she had just been in there. As if she might walk back in at any moment. He looked down and read the last few lines she had written. Harry growing colder. Must recalibrate. Media op before Christmas. Target Camilla. Leverage sympathy. Avoid direct blame. Play mental health angle. Use motherhood if needed. He backed away from the table. He didn't know what to think. His brain was refusing to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just personal. This wasn't about a strained marriage. This was calculated architecture, an entire campaign mapped out in private. He left the room without touching anything else. He didn't shut the door. He just walked back through the hallway and sat down in the living room, staring out into the garden where the dogs were play fighting. His heart was racing, but on the outside he looked still, numb. He thought back over the last 5 years. The media firestorms, the feuds, the endless narrative of victimhood. He had believed every word. He had defended her against his family, against the press, against the country that raised him. He thought he had been protecting her. Now, he wasn't so sure who had been protecting who. Later that day, Meghan never mentioned the room. She went about her routine as if nothing had happened. She laughed at something on her phone. She asked if he wanted to order sushi or cook. He said he wasn't hungry. She didn't ask why. Harry didn't sleep that night. He waited until she was in bed, then went back to the room. This time he brought his phone. He took pictures, not because he intended to release them, but because he needed proof that it wasn't in his head. He needed to be sure this wasn't a hallucination, that the woman he married had actually built a war room against his own blood. He found a folder on the shelf labeled Contingency. Inside were typed pages titled Exit Options, Controlled Narrative Structures, and Public Positioning Strategy Post-Divorce, if required. There was even a mock timeline of how to retain public sympathy in the event of a split, complete with draft talking points and media outlet preferences. The date on the document? 6 months before their Oprah interview. Harry sat on the floor of that room for almost an hour. When he finally stood up, he wasn't the same. He would never be the same again. This was the day he found the room. The day he realized the fairy tale had cracks far deeper than he imagined. The day he began to question whether he had married someone with a personal vendetta, not just against the crown, but against his very sense of belonging, identity, and truth. The silence between them the next morning was deafening. She smiled as if nothing had changed, but everything had. That was the beginning of the unraveling. And as you'll see in the next chapter, what Harry found was only the surface. What was in the room would go on to destroy his trust, fracture his worldview, and raise the question that haunts him still. Did she ever really love him, or was he just part of the strategy? When Harry returned the second time, it was late. The house was dark. Meghan was asleep upstairs, or at least pretending to be. He couldn't be sure anymore. He moved carefully, silently, down the hallway. His bare feet padded across the floor with the caution of someone entering hostile territory. The door was still ajar, exactly as he had left it. No sign that anything had been touched, moved, or erased. He opened it fully now, no hesitation. This time he needed answers. No more shock, no more confusion, just understanding. He stepped inside, turned on the desk lamp, and closed the door behind him. The room smelled faintly of old paper, ink, and something artificial, like a scented candle burned down to wax. It was windowless, a converted storage space, maybe once a guest bedroom. Now it felt like the epicenter of something far more calculated. Harry took a deep breath and turned in a slow circle. To the right of the door, a full wall was devoted to media coverage. Dozens of printouts from digital news articles were pinned in vertical rows, many of them heavily marked with highlighters. Green for positive sentiment, red for hostile tone, yellow for neutral but manipulable. Each article was dated, annotated, and categorized by topic: racism, family tension, mental health, independence, privacy. What stood out was the pattern. Each wave of media coverage was followed by what appeared to be a planned response. Sticky notes with dates that corresponded to press releases, public appearances, or leaks. Meghan hadn't been reacting to the media. She had been orchestrating it, shaping it, redirecting the flow of the narrative like a skilled PR general waging psychological warfare. To his left, The second wall held the family analysis section. Here, things got more personal. He moved closer. Kate's face stared back at him from multiple angles. Gala events, candid moments, funeral photos. Next to each photo were notes, detailed descriptions of facial expressions, posture, hand positioning. Labels like faux modesty and emotional restraint as performative empathy. A line of red string connected Kate to William. More notes. Over-reliant on brotherly image. Guarded. Easily provoked if Kate targeted publicly. Another string linked Kate to Charles. Protective dynamic. Use wedge strategy if needed. It wasn't just speculation. It was an active assessment, psychological warfare at a familial level. The kind that people trained in manipulation or high-stakes PR might recognize. But to Harry it felt monstrous. He moved to William's section. Fewer pictures, but just as many notes. Meghan had compiled statements William had made over the years, press quotes, royal speeches, even offhand remarks from family gatherings. All analyzed for tone, motive, subtext. One quote stood out, circled in thick ink. "We're very much not a racist family." Below it, Meghan had written, "Expected deflection. Reframe as gaslighting. Amplify public doubt." He remembered when William had said it. The aftermath of the Oprah interview. The palace had been under siege. That statement was meant to be calming, honest. But now Harry saw how Meghan had planned to turn even that into ammunition. The worst was Charles's section. On one side of the wall there were printed emails. Communications between the palace and their joint staff. Meghan had gotten copies somehow, likely through shared inboxes or forwarded documents from sympathetic aides. The notes attached weren't just about media management. They were about legacy. She had written, in the margin of one printed memo, "He only sees image, not blood. He's vulnerable to moral framing. Use the modern monarchy angle to box him into silence." Another note, beneath a photo of Charles at a public event, read, "Target him through moral contradiction. Public eco-campaigner versus private jet hypocrisy. Set trap." Harry stepped back. His heart pounded. He didn't want to believe she was capable of this. But it was all here. Documented. Categorized. Weaponized. He turned to the center table again. A laptop was open but sleeping. He didn't touch it. Instead, he opened a black binder labeled Archival Narrative Management. Inside were printed screenshots of Meghan's own social media posts, interviews, and photos, each one accompanied by a breakdown of its intended impact. Example, Instagram post, 2020. Black and white photo of Meghan holding Archie, head turned slightly downward. Caption, "We're just trying to breathe." Notes beside it, visual vulnerability, reinforces soft motherhood archetype. Offset backlash from Frogmore headlines. Time for maximum sympathy alignment. Another section, Netflix docuseries impact projections. Charts, graphs, emotional arcs. Harry stared in disbelief. This wasn't just media prep. This was propaganda architecture. He sat down at the table, overwhelmed. His hands trembled. Every page he turned revealed more strategy, more calculation, more evidence that what he had believed to be spontaneous, raw emotion had been part of a plan. He flipped to another binder. This one was simply titled Intelligence. It held printed text messages, some from royal staff, some between Meghan and unnamed contacts. There were dossiers on certain reporters, breakdowns of which outlets were safe, which could be flipped, and which should be discredited. There were notes on anonymous leaks. Meghan had built an intelligence network within the press. Carefully, quietly, leveraging friendships, inside connections, and whispered narratives. She had done it with precision. One memo stood out. It was dated shortly after their final royal engagement. Titled, Post-Exit Positioning Strategy. Contained the following bullet points. Harry framed as protector, wounded but noble. Meghan positioned as abused outsider. Focus on motherhood, race, and modern independence. Use Oprah as sympathetic authority figure. Establish American identity ASAP. Target UK media credibility. Undermine royal structure through archaic framing. Harry couldn't look away. This wasn't a diary. This wasn't venting. This was a blueprint. And yet, the most chilling part wasn't the papers, or even the red string maps. It was the final page of one open folder labeled Final Leverage. It contained a list of assets. Unreleased audio, unsent letters, private texts. Materials that, according to Meghan's note at the top of the page, will force royal hand if threatened. There was a line scribbled across the bottom. If they turn on us, we don't go quietly. We go nuclear. Harry stood up, his chair sliding back against the hardwood. That's when he noticed something else. In the corner of the room, half obscured by a stack of boxes, was a corkboard with his own face on it. Photos of him as a boy, Eton, in uniform, at his wedding, with Archie. Images of vulnerability, strength, confusion. Alongside each one, notes. Trigger points. Diana, Archie, brotherly loyalty. Predictable in emotional confrontation. Easily isolated with perceived injustice. Favors action over deliberation. Use for moral positioning. It was then that Harry felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Not of her. Not exactly. But of how far he had been pulled away from who he used to be. Of how much of his own life had been steered by the very tactics mapped out on the walls of this room. He had always believed he was doing the right thing. Protecting his wife. Defending his family. Speaking his truth. But what if it hadn't been his truth at all? What if the whole time, the story he'd been telling the world wasn't just crafted by her, but engineered for him to believe? And in that moment, surrounded by red string, notes, timelines, and strategies, Harry felt something break. A man can stand against the world if he knows what he's fighting for. But what if he's just a pawn? Or behind him? Nothing felt real anymore. And still, he told himself maybe, just maybe, there was some way to explain this. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. Not formally. Not out loud. Just quietly to himself. Please let there be another explanation. Please let me be wrong. He didn't sleep that night. Not a second. When morning came, the sun bled through the windows like a cruel spotlight. Meghan walked into the kitchen, yawning, tying her robe. She smiled, asked if he'd made coffee. He nodded, said nothing. She didn't notice the difference in his eyes. Or maybe she did and pretended not to. She talked about her day. A meeting. Podcast offer. A photo shoot they'd been asked to consider. She laughed when she saw something on her phone. He watched her from across the room like a stranger. Everything she said sounded normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. She asked him a question. He didn't even remember what it was. Something mundane. He mumbled a reply. She accepted it without hesitation. Later that morning, she left to run errands. The moment the door closed behind her, he went back into the room. Not to take more photos. Not to dig further. Just to be sure he hadn't imagined it. But it was all still there. Unmoved. Undisturbed. The timelines. The notes. The phrases that cut him deeper than any tabloid headline ever had. He stood there a long time. And then, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just grief. It was the first spark of betrayal. He wasn't ready to confront her yet. But he knew he would have to. Eventually. You can't unsee what he had seen. And no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, no matter how many times he told himself there must be a good reason, deep down he already knew the truth. He had married someone who was playing a game he didn't understand. And now the only question left was this. Had he been a partner in that game? Or just a pawn? That question echoed in his mind for days. Everywhere he went, it followed him. In meetings, in interviews, in moments with the children. Every time Meghan spoke, he listened differently. Analyzing. Searching for signs. Clues. Proof of authenticity, or confirmation of deceit. It was a silent war, and she didn't even know it had begun. He told no one. Not his therapist. Not his friends. Because how do you even start that conversation? How do you tell someone you think your wife may have staged your entire shared reality? that she might be at war with your own family, not out of defense but out of ambition, that maybe, just maybe, everything you thought you were running from was never as dangerous as the person running beside you? The denial began to crack. Slowly, painfully, because denial only survives in silence. And Harry had finally stepped into the noise. This was the beginning of his awakening. But what he would do next, that would change everything. He had always trusted her instincts. Meghan's ability to read a room, sense what people wanted to hear, frame her words with just the right mix of empathy and assertiveness. That's what had drawn him to her in the first place. She was magnetic, unapologetically confident. She could pivot conversations, shift moods, command sympathy. Harry admired that, needed it even. In the shadow of royal expectation, her clarity had seemed like truth. But now, standing in front of the wall again, 2 days after the discovery, 2 nights of no sleep, Harry saw those qualities not as strengths, but as weapons. He was no longer overwhelmed. The fog had lifted. What remained now was a need to understand. He opened a fresh notepad and began to do what no part of him wanted to do: analyze the materials. He approached it methodically, line by line, word by word. The first category, media manipulation. This section of the room was meticulously labeled. A large hand-drawn calendar covered half a wall, marking key dates. Public engagements, press releases, social media posts, Oprah, Netflix, the podcast interviews, the Spotify fallout, the Netflix documentary drop, the birth announcements, and the infamous "we're stepping back" Instagram post. What made it chilling was how each date was paired with measurable media metrics. Meghan had printed out analytics reports from various PR tools, engagement rates, sentiment tracking, trending hashtags. She had spreadsheets of headline types, tone breakdowns from news outlets, even reader comment statistics. Red flags were marked next to dips in public favor, with margin notes on how to reverse the narrative within a 72-hour window. It wasn't paranoia. It was surgical. She didn't react to stories. She preempted them. When rumors of tension with Kate had first leaked, Meghan hadn't denied them. According to the notes, she had timed her Vogue guest editorship to overshadow the headlines. It worked. Harry remembered thinking at the time how proud he was that she didn't let the tabloids control the narrative. Now, he realized she had controlled it all along. Another page stood out, an analysis of the Sussex's 2021 appearance at the Global Citizen Live event. A bullet-point summary read, outfit symbolism, Diana reference, optics of continuity, public body language, hand-holding equals unity, counter rumors of tension, media goal, establish us as political voices beyond royalty, suggested follow-up, UN appearance within 90 days. And there, 3 months later, was the UN speech. Another carefully orchestrated move. Not coincidence. Sequence. He moved to the next section, family leverage. This was where things became deeply personal. Meghan had created psychological profiles of each key royal figure, emotional strengths, reputational weaknesses, likely responses to public scandal. William was labeled temperamental under stress. Kate, image-dependent, rarely confrontational. Charles, desperate to be modern, susceptible to moral pressure. Camilla, low public favorability equals weak defense position. Each person was mapped out not as family, but as a stakeholder. Next to these profiles were long documents with potential pressure points. For example, in a folder labeled Kate Emotional Distancing Strategy, Meghan had drafted a media pitch plan designed to contrast Kate's perceived coldness with her own image as warm and inclusive. Suggested outlets were listed. Potential sympathetic journalists. Timelines for optimal release windows, usually close to Kate's public events to split attention, as noted in a red pen margin. Another document focused on Charles. It outlined what Meghan called morality traps. One section described how to provoke statements from the palace that would appear dismissive or outdated, allowing Meghan to position herself as progressive and outspoken by comparison. She even listed phrasing that should be used in interviews to bait a defensive response. Harry closed the folder slowly. His throat was dry. The handwriting was familiar. Neat, exact, confident. He wanted to believe it wasn't malicious. That maybe she was simply trying to survive in a family and a system that had failed her. But there was something undeniably intentional about how she'd framed everything, as a campaign, not a reaction. Then came the most disturbing file, Narrative Engineering Harry. This was about him. He hesitated before opening it. His hand hovered. Part of him didn't want to know, but the part that needed truth won. Inside were dozens of printed emails, scripts, and press prep notes. One page was labeled Harry Talking Points, Trust Narrative. It included bullet points for interviews. I just wanted to protect my family. I couldn't stay silent anymore. We were trapped in a cycle, and I didn't even know it. Each quote had a subheading. Emotional target. Empathy. Intended outcome. Frame departure as necessary, not selfish. He had said those things, word for word, in Oprah, in interviews, in speeches. Had they been fed to him? Was anything he said his own? Further down, another memo read, reinforce Harry's break from royal identity. Use his mental health journey to build distance. Validate his emotional trauma while positioning Meghan as supportive, healing force. It was devastating to read. His own pain leveraged. He remembered filming the Apple TV Plus mental health documentary. Meghan had encouraged it. She had said it would help people inspire others. He believed her, and maybe it had. But now, seeing how even that had been mapped out ahead of time, he couldn't ignore the possibility that it had also served another purpose, reinforcing her narrative. In the corner of the folder was a list of questions Meghan had flagged as vulnerabilities. Will Harry regret leaving? Does he miss his brother? Would he ever return to the UK? Does he believe Meghan manipulated him? Next to each question were answers she had pre-written for him. Not suggested. Written. The implication was clear. Control. He flipped through the last section of the materials. Damage control strategies. These were drafted plans in case of scandal. Leaks. Divorce. Exposure. Each scenario had a corresponding script, press angle, and social media rollout. One plan included immediate publication of a personal essay by Meghan in a high-profile American magazine, reframing events through the lens of healing and self-discovery. Another scenario, in the event of a palace backlash, included scheduling a charitable visit with Archie and coordinated photos to humanize the story. It wasn't the existence of these plans that unnerved Harry. It was the tone. Cold, tactical, detached. There was a file simply titled Worst Case, Total Separation. He opened it. It was a step-by-step breakdown of how Meghan would maintain control of her public image during a divorce. First paragraph. If Harry turns hostile, immediately reframe the narrative as emotional fallout from unresolved childhood trauma. Position him as someone deserving of compassion but lacking stability. Offer love in statements but avoid responsibility. Harry nearly dropped the folder. It was like reading a script for a performance he didn't know he was starring in. He backed away from the table. Everything in the room felt different now. The walls that once felt obsessive now felt weaponized. The paper no longer looked like notes, they looked like traps. He glanced at his own notepad. Blank, except for the word he had written without thinking. Why? That question echoed through his head. Why would someone who claimed to love him do this? Why wasn't trust enough? Why couldn't she just be honest? Why had she built this war room, this fortress of strategy, this monument to control? And then the hardest question of all. Why didn't he see it? Maybe he did. Maybe some part of him always knew. Maybe that's why he was always a little on edge, a little too defensive, a little too quick to lash out in her defense. Because deep down, some part of him feared that if he ever stopped defending her, everything would fall apart. And now it had. He left the room in silence again. But this time he took something with him. Not just the photos. Not just the evidence. He took clarity. Because now he knew. This wasn't miscommunication. This wasn't media misunderstanding. This wasn't family dysfunction. This was a campaign. A strategy. And he had been its most powerful pawn. The materials didn't lie. They told the real story. And Harry, for the first time, was finally ready to hear it. The board was large, 7 feet across, 4 feet high, covered in cork, covered in pins, covered in names Harry had known since childhood. He had avoided this part of the room on his first visit. Even the second time, he hadn't let himself truly look. It had felt too surreal, too sinister, like if he stared at it too long, he'd somehow make it all real. But now he couldn't avoid it. The rest of the room was horrifying in its detail, but this wall was different. This wasn't just about information. This wall was war.at. The center of the corkboard was Kate. A black and white photograph of her from a charity gala, mid-smile, was pinned with surgical precision. Red string stretched outward from her image in nearly a dozen directions. To William, Charles, Camilla, a handful of press outlets, even to Harry himself. It was a web. Deliberate, tactical, insidious. Above Kate's photo, in bold marker, were the words, "Primary rival. Indirect targeting only." He stared at that phrase for a long time. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. Perfectly. The use of indirect was clinical, chilling. It implied something worse than open confrontation. It suggested strategy, calculated manipulation, quiet sabotage. Below her image, Meghan had listed traits. Publicly adored. Natural future queen appeal. Difficult to attack without backlash. Uses silence effectively. Vulnerable to emotional reframing. Next to those lines, Meghan had drawn a Venn diagram, 2 overlapping circles. One labeled traditional royal appeal, the other modern feminist values. In the middle, where they overlapped, she had written Kate's name. Harry couldn't look away. His stomach twisted. She wasn't just jealous of Kate. She studied her, measured her, broke her down like a competitor in a media game show. He followed the red thread from Kate's photo to William's. His brother's image was an older one, taken before the tension had become visible in public. It had clearly been chosen to represent the old William, the one Harry had grown up beside, trusted, loved. Above William's image, Meghan had written, "Proxy aggressor, Project Insecurity." Underneath that, a list of action items. Use Harry's interviews to frame William as controlling. Amplify emotional distance between brothers. Reframe sibling tension as rooted in class elitism. Do not attack directly, let the audience connect the dots. Encourage Harry to share stories of pressure from Will. Harry's eyes froze on that last line. Encourage Harry to share stories. He remembered those conversations, him and Meghan late at night, talking about growing up royal, about expectations, about the invisible rules. He'd opened up to her in those moments. Not as a political act, but because he trusted her. Because she made him feel safe. And now he saw those moments for what they were, data points. Fuel for the narrative. The betrayal burned in a way nothing else had. He followed the threads again. Camilla's image was near the bottom. Smaller, less central, but no less targeted. Label, silent liability, moral disruptor. Meghan's notes below. Low media affection can be used as public scapegoat. Link Camilla to outdated royal attitudes. Subtly associate her with cold monarchy archetype. Useful when contrasting Meghan's modern warmth. Possible leak strategy. Anonymous source implication. Harry remembered the wave of press stories that followed the Oprah interview. How the media, without being told directly, began painting Camilla as part of the problem. It hadn't made sense at the time, why drag her into it? Now it made perfect sense. She was expendable, a useful target, a way to redirect anger without invoking the Queen or Charles too directly. Then came Charles. His photo sat to the left of Kate's, strategically placed. Meghan had annotated the margins heavily. Phrases circled and underlined, again and again. Needs legacy approval. Use modern monarchy as bait. Wants to be seen as a bridge. Isn't one. Relies on public stability. Threaten with instability optics. Harry didn't even realize he was shaking. He scanned the smaller notes attached to Charles's section. Some were observational. Comments on his body language, tone, public warmth. Others were tactical. Exploit father-son narrative. Publicly credit Charles with partial support, followed by disappointment arc. Never fully condemn. Always leave room for reconciliation. Makes Charles appear unpredictable. Leak private communication details only when necessary. It was all there, laid out. A step-by-step guide on how to make the public root for Meghan while painting Charles as weak, conflicted, or out of touch. Harry felt ill. At the bottom of the board was a smaller section. Not a royal, a journalist. There was a photo of a well-known UK royal correspondent. Notes about her past stories, her tone, her biases. Meghan had highlighted moments when the reporter had criticized her wardrobe, her speeches, even her parenting. Beside the photo was a note in block capitals. Expose her personal bias. Dismantle her credibility. It was written like an order. Harry stepped back, overwhelmed again. The whole wall was a living document. One Meghan had clearly updated over time. Some threads had been removed and replaced. Some sections were more worn, as if she'd spent more time revisiting them. One area had been added more recently, Harry guessed. It was labeled American Public Positioning. There, Meghan had pinned logos of talk shows, headlines from The Cut, Time magazine, Vanity Fair. She had written keywords next to each: empathy, victimhood, progress, race, empowerment, privacy. Each word was color-coded, matched to a set of media strategies. Harry took a deep breath and looked at the board one last time. This wasn't a shrine to pain. It wasn't even a vent for frustration. It was a war map. Each person represented a challenge. Each challenge had a counter. And every counter had a narrative. He thought of how she'd presented herself publicly. Smiling, gracious, hands pressed gently to her heart when talking about kindness, love, healing. Always the tone of someone who wanted peace. But this board told another story. Peace wasn't the goal. Control was. And Harry? He hadn't just been a player in this war. He had been the weapon. He was the insider, the whistleblower, the damaged royal willing to speak up. That was how she had used him. He didn't know if Meghan loved him. That question was still too raw, too tangled in memory and emotion. But he knew with full certainty now that she had used him. And not just against the royals, against himself. He turned away from the board. His mind replayed every moment she had ever encouraged him to speak. Every interview, every anecdote she nudged him to share. The moments she had framed as catharsis were really calibration. She was adjusting the optics, not healing the trauma. He leaned against the doorframe, exhausted. He felt the weight of what he now understood. This wall was the blueprint of a media war. But worse, it was a map of the dismantling of a family. Not a perfect family, not a fair family, but his family. And Meghan had approached it not with confusion or heartbreak, but with surgical detachment. With strategy. Harry sat alone on the back patio. It was just past 6 a.m., but he'd already been awake for hours. The California sky was painted with soft streaks of early light. The birds were beginning their chorus. And yet, despite the peace around him, his mind was a battlefield. The room, the board, the notes, all of it. He had seen it, photographed it, read it, and still, part of him asked the question he wasn't ready to silence. Was this all real, or was he just losing his mind? He tapped the side of his mug. The coffee had gone cold. Tactics or paranoia? That was the line, the threshold, the chasm between explanation and accusation. Because there was another way to look at it. A less terrifying way. A version of the story where Meghan wasn't manipulating him, but simply trying to protect herself. Maybe even protect them. What if the wall of string and photos and plans was just how she processed trauma? What if the annotations were a form of self-defense, not attack? What if she'd created that room the way someone else might keep a journal or see a therapist? People who've been hurt, especially repeatedly, publicly, and without consequence, sometimes build walls. Psychological ones, emotional ones, or in this case, literal ones. Was that what this was? Was this her shield? Not her sword? Harry clenched his jaw. It was a generous interpretation, one he wanted to believe. But then again, not everyone catalogs family weaknesses like a political strategist. Not everyone drafts full-scale media playbooks about their spouse's inner pain. Not everyone prepares talking points for a divorce they never said they wanted. There were lines you didn't cross unless you meant to cross them. Still, the question haunted him. Was this madness or method? Had Meghan created a room of strategy or a room of obsession? Because obsession, in its early stages, often looks a lot like preparedness. And Meghan had always been prepared. For everything. She studied the media like a general studies enemy tactics. She understood how emotion moved an audience, how timing controlled perception, how silence could be louder than any statement. These weren't coincidences. She had mastered the art of public manipulation the way an athlete masters muscle memory. And he had admired it until now. He stared at the garden ahead. It wasn't just the materials. It was the pattern. He remembered their private conversations, how quickly she turned sympathy into strategy. If someone hurt her, she didn't just express pain. She planned how to present that pain to others. What to say, what to hold back, what to let leak. And it always worked. She knew how to own the room, and if she couldn't own it, she'd dismantle it. But where did trauma end and control begin? He went back inside. Not to the war room. He couldn't bear to see it again. Instead, he went to her office, a place she kept pristine, polished, almost sacred. She was obsessive about that space. She had once joked, "That's my little White House." But now it didn't feel like a joke. He opened her desk drawer. Inside was a notebook, clean leather cover, minimalist design. Meghan's style. He opened it. Inside, the pages were neat. Too neat. Bullet points. Schedules. Headlines, and then quotes. At first, they seemed innocuous. Make them think they know you, then control what they think they know. It's not manipulation if it's survival. You don't have to win every battle. Just make the other side bleed enough to stop fighting. Harry closed the notebook, stunned. These weren't the thoughts of someone just trying to survive. These were mantras, beliefs, rules, and they weren't new. He remembered something his therapist once told him. People tell you who they are long before you're ready to hear it. Maybe she had told him, too. Maybe he just hadn't been listening. Still, part of him fought the narrative. What if he was overanalyzing? Seeing intent where there was only pain? Turning her anxiety into a conspiracy? After all, hadn't he lived with paranoia himself? The press hounding him since childhood. The trauma of Diana's death. The constant suspicion, the fear of betrayal, the belief that no one outside the palace could be trusted. Was he projecting? It was possible. But then he remembered the photographs of his family with red excess through them. The hand-drawn flowcharts of royal alliances, press cycles, and public sentiment. The calendar of leak timing options. The page labeled Harry's emotional leverage, trigger script options. And suddenly the debate ended. This wasn't paranoia. This was protocol. She didn't build that room because she was scared. She built it because she was planning something. She wasn't hiding. She was preparing. And that realization, it changed everything. He thought about the difference between a tactic and a trauma response. Trauma responses are defensive. They're messy, erratic, emotional. But tactics are smooth, intentional, precise. Everything in that room was precise. The way the articles were printed and labeled. The way the quotes were color-coded. The way even his own words were dissected and stored like assets. No, this wasn't paranoia. This was playbook thinking. It wasn't about Meghan being crazy. It was about her being cold, calculated. He sat down at the kitchen island. The sunlight had fully taken the room now. The soft glow lit up the countertops, the floor, even the photos on the fridge. Family shots. Him and Meghan on the beach. Meghan holding Archie. A photo of the Queen with baby Lilibet. They looked happy. And maybe in that moment they were. But those were moments. Not the whole picture. The whole picture was pinned up in a hidden room. Wrapped in string, marked in ink, staged like a tactical operation. Harry tapped the table. He needed someone to talk to. But who? He couldn't go to the palace. Not yet. They would weaponize it, twist it, maybe even bury it. He couldn't go to the press. That would only make him look unstable, disloyal, desperate. And he couldn't go to Meghan. Not yet. Not until he understood her endgame. Because right now, that's what terrified him the most. Not what she had done, but what she might still be planning. Was this phase 1? Was there a phase 2? A phase 3? The room felt too complete to be dormant. It wasn't an archive. It was a command center. And command centers don't exist for nothing. He opened his laptop. He stared at a blank email, then closed it again. He wasn't ready, but he would be. Soon. Because now he wasn't just confused. He was watching, listening, planning in his own way. And if this was a game, finally, he understood the rules.